Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Lily Swillman, and on behalf of Oxford Speaks and the Oxford Law Society, we are honored to be joined by Kenneth Roth. Just a few housekeeping notes before we begin. Please keep all cell phones on silent and note the emergency exits. Kenneth Roth is an American human rights lawyer who served as the executive director of Human Rights Watch from 1993 to 2022. He studied history at Brown University before receiving his Juris Doctor from Yale Law School in 1980. Ken worked in private practice in the U.S. Department of Justice for the Southern District of New York in the early 1980s before joining HRW as Deputy Director in 1987. He became Executive Director in 1993, and his tenure saw Human Rights Watch become perhaps the foremost human rights NGO. It grew from having 60 staff to 552, and shared the Nobel Peace Prize in 1997 for the banning of anti-personnel mines. Since leaving HRW, Ken has served as a visiting professor at the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. Ken will give some prepared remarks on his experiences at HRW, the world of human rights, and the Israel-Gaza war before taking questions. Please join me in welcoming Ken Roth.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. As was noted, I'm willing kind of during the Q&A to talk about anything. So, anything in the world, I'm happy to kind of talk about, my experience at Human Rights Watch, lessons that I've drawn from it. But what I thought I would do is just kind of open up with a much more focused set of remarks, looking at Gaza, because that's, the big topical issue. And I thought it would be, just useful to set forth my understanding of how one might look at Gaza. And let me just sort of say at the outset that I'm going to do this not from a perspective that's pro-Israeli or pro-Palestinian, but rather one that's pro-civilian. And I want to look at Gaza through the lens of international humanitarian law and laws of war, which are basically the Geneva Conventions and their protocols, that are a series of quite detailed laws that everybody has ratified, that are designed to try to spare civilians as much as possible the hazards of armed conflict. And I think that that law helps to cut through what is clearly a super partisan issue, where people have very strong views one way or the other. And as I've spoken about Gaza before different audiences like yourself, I found that kind of bringing in this perspective just helps people find some common ground when otherwise they might be very divided. So let me run through that for about 20 minutes or so, and then we will have a conversation. Now, let me begin, as one should, with October 7th. And what Hamas did was pretty straightforwardly a war crime, a massive war crime. Because a basic premise of humanitarian law is you don't slaughter civilians. You don't abduct civilians. You don't abuse civilians or rape civilians. And so that's kind of just black letter law. That's not even terribly controversial. But some people say, Hamas, they needed to resist Israeli occupation, Israeli apartheid, Israeli repression, the blockade. So, they were therefore supposedly justified in doing what they did. And the simple answer to that is no, they weren't. That it's one thing to say you have a right to resist occupation, say. And if they had done that by, firing at Israeli soldiers, they would be operating within the laws of war. But they attacked civilians. And so the justice of one's cause is utterly irrelevant to the duty to spare civilians. And there is simply no excuse for what Hamas did on October 7th. So I want to put that forth because some people tend to try to find reasons to justify what Hamas did. But if you move beyond saying Hamas had a right to resist to saying Hamas had a right to attack civilians, then you move into war crime territory. Now, Israel has responded, obviously. And the principles that I just articulated with respect to Hamas apply equally to Israel. So, some people say, well, Hamas just committed these terrible atrocities, so Israel's entitled to do whatever it does. And that's wrong. humanitarian law is not premised on reciprocity. It doesn't say you've only got to respect, civilian life if the other side did. It imposes an independent obligation on both sides. And so the fact that one side commits war crimes doesn't justify the other side committing war crimes. The fact that one side may want to destroy Israel, that they may want to kill all the Jews, whether or not that's true or not, if those are the allegations, it still doesn't matter. Israel has a duty in its response to comply with international military law. And indeed, if not, if Israel would say, we can rip up the Geneva Conventions because we think we're right, then Hamas could do the same thing. Because everybody always thinks they're right. Nobody goes into a conflict and says, we're fighting the battle that is morally wrong. Everybody thinks they're right. So that's why humanitarian law, the obligations to spare civilians, don't depend on the justice of your cause. They are just an absolute obligation imposed on everyone. So let's look at, how does humanitarian law apply to Israel? What does it say about its conduct? And I'm going to run through kind of a few different requirements of humanitarian law. Even though the Geneva Conventions are incredibly thick and they're very detailed, they really are quite simple in their essence. One basic rule is you don't target civilians. That's what Hamas did on October 7th. Israel, to begin with, has been targeting certain civilian institutions where there is little, if any, justification that there was a military purpose for doing this. For example, they have deliberately exploded, destroyed certain university campuses. And the argument that they gave was, these were used to train Hamas intelligence operatives. Do you think there was ever an MI5 or MI6 agent that went to Oxford? Is Oxford suddenly a legitimate military target? This is a wacko justification. It's not a justification. To attack something requires that it currently is posing a military threat. And so whatever might have happened in the past, whether this training of intelligence operatives are true or not, provides zero justification for destroying a university. And there have been a series of, of kind of culturally or socially important buildings that have been attacked deliberately by Israel, seemingly for the purpose of just, wiping out key elements of Palestinian society. So a number of the big, prestigious apartment buildings were just decimated. Sometimes Israel bothered to say, there might have been a Hamas presence someplace, but usually they don't even bother. They're just blowing up these huge buildings. And the idea is to kind of take the most visible symbols of Palestinian life in Gaza and destroy them. Clear war crimes. There's no justification for doing this. Second, Israel has been attacking certain civilian neighborhoods indiscriminately. And humanitarian law says if you're going to fire at a military target, you've got to aim as precisely as you can at that target. You can't just say, there was a few targets in this neighborhood, let's decimate the neighborhood. But what Israel's been doing is been decimating neighborhoods. And, using, in many cases, dumb bombs. About 50% of the bombs Israel has been dropping have not been precision-guided weapons. They've just been dumb bombs you drop from an airplane and hope for the best. They've been using very large bombs. And so if you look at certain neighborhoods, particularly in northern Gaza, they've just been wiped out. So that is indiscriminate warfare, which is also war. Now sometimes when Israel is attacking a military target, which it's obviously entitled to do, that is, a fortification or missile launchers or concentrations of troops, it's allowed to attack that. But it is doing it with means that are clearly, foreseeably going to cause disproportionate civilian harm. And one of the requirements is that if you're going to attack a military target, the concrete military advantage cannot be overshadowed by disproportionate civilian harm. And in many ways, the clearest example of Israel violating that rule is when it has gone after some of the Hamas tunnels, not with, directed bombs, but with these huge 2,000-pound bombs. And I realize that, the term 2,000 pounds is kind of meaningless. But let me just kind of put this in context. The US these days will not use a 2,000-pound bomb in a populated area. It will not use a 1,000-pound bomb in a populated area. It is very reluctant to use a 500-pound bomb in a populated area. Israel has been using 2,000-pound bombs extensively in Gaza. And these are enormous bombs that, when dropped in a civilian neighborhood, decimate the neighborhood, predictably. And it hasn't done this just once or twice. It has done this hundreds of times. And this, epitomizes disproportionate harm. Now, another example of this is the way Israel has treated healthcare in Gaza. People in today's world need healthcare day to day. If you, need dialysis or cancer treatment, or, if you're pregnant and you need, want to give birth, the ordinary things of life, you need healthcare. You need healthcare that much more if there's a war going on. Bombs are being dropped, and those people who survive, many of them get injured. So there's this enormous need for healthcare in the middle of a war. And Israel has been systematically attacking healthcare. Sometimes actually attacking ambulances and healthcare workers, but most visibly shutting down hospitals. Occupying them, surrounding them. Today there's a standoff in Khan Yunis with snipers surrounding the major hospital there, making it impossible for people to come and go. And this, has the consequence of weaponizing healthcare, depriving people of healthcare at a moment of acute need. And you've all heard the explanation. Al-Shifa Hospital, which was Gaza's biggest, it's in Gaza City, and the Israelis said, Hamas, they had a command center underneath Al-Shifa Hospital. And when they finally took over the hospital, what did they show us? A few rifles and a tunnel. It wasn't clear whether that tunnel was built by Hamas. There was an Israeli official who said, well, actually, we built that tunnel back when we still controlled Gaza. But in any event, there are tunnels every place in Gaza. And a tunnel is not a command center. And so for this, minimal past Hamas presence, Israel has shut down the largest hospital in Gaza. Today, it basically is a displaced persons camp, and they offer first aid, but no advanced medical care. And similar things have happened at a range of hospitals throughout the Gaza Strip. So here you can say, okay, there, is a modest, perhaps sometimes military target there, but it is being addressed in a way that is wholly disproportionate in the consequences it imposes on the civilian population. So we have, targeting of civilian institutions, the use of indiscriminate warfare, the use of disproportionate warfare. And then the last thing I want to mention is the restriction on humanitarian aid, the siege. Now, I think you're all aware that Gaza has been under an Israeli-imposed blockade for 16 years, since Hamas took over the Gaza Strip. This is supported by Egypt, but primarily enforced by Israel. And so already, travel from Gaza was very difficult. Commerce was very difficult. That's why, people say, why didn't the Palestinians build in Singapore or the Middle East and Gaza? They weren't allowed to trade. There was a blockade. So it was, it's part of why the civilian population of Gaza is so dependent on humanitarian aid. And then since October 7th, there's been a siege. So electricity has been shut off, and most of the electricity is produced in Israel. This is one way where they kept control. The supply of water has been restricted. And of course, food and medicine has been severely restricted. Now, in the argument in The Hague before the International Court of Justice, the genocide case brought by South Africa, Israel's lawyers said, oh, but we're letting in aid. Look, we built up these few kind of emergency hospitals. We're allowing in trucks, and the court looked at them and said, you can't be serious in essence, because everybody agrees that today starvation is widespread in Gaza. Everybody is hungry. A number of people are facing imminent famine. There is a horrible humanitarian situation, which is indisputable. And while there are drips and drabs of aid allowed in, it is wholly insufficient to meet the enormous needs of a largely displaced population. Today we're all focused on Rafah, which is the southernmost city of Gaza. And there are 1.4 million Palestinians mostly camping in Rafah. People who've moved from the north to the south under Israeli bombardment. And they have very little. Only bits and pieces of aid are getting across the border. So humanitarian law requires a state to permit access to humanitarian aid by a civilian population in need. And that just is not happening. That is, again, a war crime. So these are sort of just an outline of the war crimes that Israel is committing today. Let's, for a moment, take a look at what their defenses are. So, one of the defenses on aid was, okay, we're letting some aid in, but, clearly not enough. One of the big defenses, which I'm sure you all heard, is human shields. Hamas is using civilian institutions as human shields. And sometimes it is. Sometimes Hamas is firing from civilian populated areas, endangering civilians needlessly, another war crime by Hamas. But none of that absolves Israel of the duty still not to fire indiscriminately, not to fire when the consequences on civilians are going to be disproportionate. So the fact that Hamas is using human shields doesn't justify indifference to the civilian consequences. And that, is frankly what we're seeing over and over. It never justifies the 2,000-pound bombs, for example. No human shield is justification for that. Now, another argument is we gave warnings. And in fact, humanitarian law does oblige warning parties to give a warning, if possible, is the way it puts, advance warning before attacking. And Israel has done that, although it tends to do it, take this humanitarian step in a relatively inhumane way. By which I mean, it doesn't say, we're about to attack. Sometimes it does say, we're about to attack your building, evacuate your building. I think we all kind of heard those stories where people get text messages, you got 5 minutes to evacuate, then they bomb the building, but at least everybody's left. That's the right thing to do. But Israel's been saying, clear out of northern Gaza, then clear out of central Gaza, then clear out of Khan Yunis in southern Gaza, and now clear out of Rafah, to where? And that is inhumane when first Israel doesn't stop bombing. So there have been repeated instances where the routes by which people are evacuating are bombed. But most significantly, people are being evacuated to places where there's no way to receive them. No housing, no food, no medical aid, nothing. They are living in tents or they're cramming into apartments. And so the warnings really don't certainly justify the lack of humanitarian access. And they don't justify these indiscriminate, disproportionate methods of attack that I've described. So that's a quick outline of what humanitarian law has to say here. Let me say a few things about the international response. First, you all followed, I'm sure, the International Court of Justice genocide case brought by South Africa. Now, genocide is actually a different body of law. There's, the Geneva Conventions and the protocols, which are international humanitarian law. the Genocide Convention is a separate law, actually adopted the year before the 1949 Geneva Conventions. It was clearly an aftermath of the Holocaust. And there's sometimes a tendency to treat the term genocide as just meaning, really bad stuff. You're killing a lot of people, therefore it's genocide. That's not the proper understanding of the term. Genocide, defined in the statute, means a number of acts, including killing or creating, severe situations of deprivation, but doing that with a very specific intent. An intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a racial, religious, national, or ethnic group. And in the case of Gaza, where the killing is of sufficient magnitude, it really all comes down to intent. And so that's what the bulk of the argument was about in The Hague. And if you read the South African application, part of what they did is they drew intent just from the acts. If you're firing indiscriminately, if you're causing all this harm, if you're causing so much disruption, you must be intending to kill a significant part of the Palestinian population. But in many ways, the most powerful part of the South African case simply quoted Israeli officials. And the most notable statements were first by the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, who memorably called Palestinians human animals. The kind of dehumanization language that often accompanies genocide. In Rwanda, they called the Tutsi cockroaches. You see this kind of language. It's easier to kill animals than to kill people. Now, Gallant had said, I was just referring to Hamas, I didn't mean Palestinians. But in fact, in one case, he said it in reference to the siege. The siege is not about Hamas, the siege is about everybody in Gaza. So that was one statement that the court found indicative of genocidal intent. Another was by the president, Herzog, who's actually a decent guy. He's not one of these crazy right-wingers in Netanyahu's cabinet. But he was the one who said, in essence, there are no innocent civilians. The people of Palestine could have, or of Gaza, could have overthrown Hamas, which is insane because Hamas is a military dictatorship. You stand up and start protesting Hamas, you get shot. But he was the one who kind of came out with this statement. And one of the, I found, most chilling pieces of evidence that the South African lawyers presented was a video of a group of Israeli soldiers singing and dancing and saying, there are no innocent civilians, there are no innocent civilians. Kind of parodying Herzog's words. And then another statement that South Africa relied on, the court in the end didn't use, was one by Netanyahu invoking the biblical story of Amalek. And I think the court didn't use it because in Israel, Amalek is often used to just refer to an enemy, a terrible enemy. But in the Bible, the reference to Amalek includes the biblical injunction to kill every man, woman, child, and animal. And so some people understood the Amalek reference with that kind of genocidal meaning. Now, the Israeli government came back and said, these are just statements, you've got to look at our official cabinet orders, those are much more measured, lawyers go through those. And, the court was not, it didn't expound at length, but it basically said, we're not persuaded that these nice official statements reflect the reality on the ground. Or even that we're seeing all of the statements, rather than just a hand-picked selection of the statements you're cherry-picking. So the court found, it didn't make a finding of whether or not Israel was committing genocide, because that's a judgment on the merits, which is a couple of years away. This was a preliminary ruling, and what they found was that it was plausible that Israel is committing genocide, and therefore it ordered certain what are known as precautionary measures. Orders to try to prevent rights under the Genocide Convention from being compromised. And the orders, it did not order a ceasefire, which frankly I never expected because Hamas was not a party to the proceedings. The International Court of Justice is just a state-to-state is for resolving state-to-state disputes, so Hamas isn't even allowed to be there. And therefore, it's not going to order Israel to stop fighting when it can't order Hamas to stop fighting. So it didn't order ceasefire, but it did order Israel to take greater care in not bombing civilians, to allow humanitarian aid in, and to stop the insightful language. And the language hasn't been repeated. Israel seems to have utterly ignored the other two elements of that order. Now, the other big international institution of relevance here is the International Criminal Court. And the International Court of Justice, as I mentioned, is basically a civil court that resolves disputes between states. In this case, it was South Africa bringing a dispute about an interpretation of the Genocide Convention to the court. The International Criminal Court prosecutes individuals, not states, but people, officials. And both are in The Hague, just to confuse you, but they're very different institutions. Karim Khan, a British barrister, is the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. And he has had an open investigation into Palestine since he took office in June 2021. And apart from a couple of eloquent statements to the media, there's been no visible sign of anything. Now he said, oh, I'm going to look after you, looking into this. He even at one point said, if Israel does not allow humanitarian aid into Gaza at scale, he used the term, kind of repeating a Security Council resolution, don't be surprised if his office brings charges. Good words. Nothing's happened yet. So he's been very slow. And it would certainly help if he went beyond words and started charging. Undoubtedly he will charge Hamas for October 7th, as he should. But he's going to have to look at Israel too. This is not temperamentally who he is. He's very attentive to kind of British and American official opinion. But he can't do his job without addressing what Israel is doing in Gaza. So the last international institution that I want to speak about is more an individual, and that is Joe Biden. Who obviously represents the US government, but I say Joe Biden because the position of the US government right now is really determined by Biden. And Biden is having a very hard time overcoming first his personal sympathy with Israel, which goes way back. But second, he is very worried about creating an issue that the Republicans can charge him with, can challenge him. And so he has been good about pressing Netanyahu to take greater steps to spare civilians and to allow in humanitarian aid. And many times he's pushed this, it's been a mantra, he's been rhetorically strong. What he hasn't done is two things. One, for the most part, he has not made a judgment about what Israel is doing. He's twice said they're using indiscriminate bombing, but he hasn't really said these are war crimes or this is wrong. He's been more the prescriptive, you should do this or that, rather than judgmental. And most important, even though the US government gives Israel $3.8 billion in military assistance every single year, and even though the US government is the primary source of weapons that Israel is using to kill in Gaza, Biden refuses to condition that assistance and those arms on anything, on any change in Israeli behavior, let alone to stop it until Israel changes. And so, the one source of leverage that Biden has, he's not willing to use. And as a result, Netanyahu, talks to him periodically on the phone, puts up with him, and ignores him. Because Netanyahu feels there's no cost. Indeed, he's getting some political benefit from standing up to the Americans. And if you look at Netanyahu's motivations, he has a very strong motivation, first, to keep this war going. Because as soon as the war ends, there's going to be a reckoning as to who is responsible for October 7th. And obviously Hamas was primarily responsible for October 7th. But in Israel, there's a big question about, why was there this enormous intelligence failure? Especially when there were many, many warning signs that an attack of that sort was in the works, and the Israeli government just didn't take it seriously. So Netanyahu is very likely to be targeted by this political examination. He's likely to lose his job. Losing his job means possibly going to prison because he's got corruption charges against him. And so he, sadly, has this incentive to keep the war going. The other awful incentive he has is that, he heads a very right-wing government. I think all know that. What people don't appreciate is how right-wing this is, because the Knesset has 120 members. Netanyahu has a 64-seat majority, a very narrow majority. And 13 of those seats, so way more than what he needs to maintain that majority, are controlled by two ministers, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, who are openly advocating the mass forced deportation of Palestinians from Gaza. And so, we're seeing, as I mentioned, Palestinians being pushed closer and closer and closer to the Egyptian border. And the question is, okay, what now? There's no place else to go. And Netanyahu is vowing to attack Rafah, this last refuge. Now, Netanyahu has said, we're going to arrange for evacuation, we'll find some place. But nothing has happened along those lines. They've already begun to attack. This rescue operation that rescued 2 hostages killed, 67 Palestinians, and that's just the beginning. But both Smotrich and Ben-Gvir are very clear. They want to just push everybody across the border into Egypt. Now, Egypt doesn't want that. They've got plenty of problems economically. They've got an insurgency in the northern Sinai. They don't want a bunch of Palestinians. But most important, they don't want to be subject or complicit in another Nakba, another catastrophe, the term that Palestinians used to refer to 1948, when 600,000 Palestinians were forced from their homes in what became Israel and never allowed back. That's why 2/3 of Gaza are the descendants of 1948 refugees, whose homes originally was in Israel. And because if you look at Israel and Palestine from the river to the sea, the population is roughly split 50-50 between Jews and Palestinians, and because the far right has no intention of giving up West Bank or Gaza. They refuse to have a two-state solution, but they have this problem. They have all these, they don't want to really control all these Palestinians. They're operating a system of apartheid. One solution is just get rid of the Palestinians. And here's an opportunity to suddenly take, 2.4 million Palestinians and just wipe them off the demographic balance sheet and stick them in Egypt. And so, the people on whom Netanyahu depends to stay in power, this is their explicit agenda. Not some little subtle thing, that's what they're saying. And he is very reluctant to repudiate that vision frontally. So, this is what makes this moment particularly difficult. And Biden, has said, we don't want anybody deported. He's objecting even to kind of creating a buffer zone that is within Gaza. But he's not willing to use the one sanction that Netanyahu might listen to, which is stopping or conditioning the aid for the arms sales. So that gives you kind of a sense of what are the laws being violated, how do we understand what Israel is doing, and how do we understand the international response so far. So I will conclude there, and I'm happy to talk about anything I just discussed or, the rest of the world.
I think Alexa and I, can you hear us in the back, by the way? Perfect. And Alexa and I had a couple of questions for you before we turn it over, though. And I kind of just want to follow up on the ICJ ruling and the broader theme of the international rules-based order and some of the concepts you've talked about. So, in an op-ed last month, you said the ICJ ruling is a repudiation of the West and of Israel's actions in Gaza. I sort of have 2 interrelated questions. Why didn't the court go so far as to demand a full ceasefire in Gaza? That's kind of something that's come up in our talks before, and it's something the former Israeli Prime Minister, when we interviewed him last week, sort of mentioned as a defense of Israel. So maybe you could talk us through that. And then this idea, the West, I think to some people here, the West seems like the the founding countries that came up with the international rules-based order and the people who put in the Geneva Conventions in the wake of World War II. And I just wonder if you think that reputation of the West is damaged or permanently destroyed.
All right, well, I mean, in terms of, as I said, why was there not a ceasefire? South Africa asked for it, so it was at least, theoretically in the cards, but in fact, it was never in the cards. For the reason that I outlined. You can't order one side to an ongoing armed conflict to stop fighting without ordering the other side to stop fighting. And Hamas was not before the court, because Hamas is not a state, and only states can appear before the court. So it was just not going to happen. And people who were sort of anticipating a ceasefire order were naive. That was just not the way things worked. The court, I think, went as far as it could. It was a bit frustrating because, the order was vague. It didn't say, stop using 2,000-pound bombs. It said, take greater care in sparing civilians, allow humanitarian aid. These were broad things. But you also have to kind of consider what these proceedings were. I mean, these were emergency proceedings, rushed. There was no fact-finding. There were no witnesses, there's no cross-examination, there's not a trial. There were, lawyers on both sides arguing and submitting evidence in writing, but no real way for the court to work through that other than kind of looking at the world. And so when you're operating at that level, you can't make specific factual findings. It's not going to operate that way. And the court, I think, went as far as it could. So this was a repudiation of the Israeli position. I mean, Israel actually came in there. I mean, the lawyers, these were not the most laudable arguments, but they kind of said, how can we, Israel, be responsible for genocide? The Jews were victims of genocide in the Holocaust, which is an absurd argument because, obviously, being in the past is not the present. You can be a victim yesterday and a perpetrator today. They said, Hamas is genocidal. Look at their charter. Look at what they did on October 7th. But of course, that's not a defense either because you can have genocide on both sides. So it just, those are the sort of cheap public relations arguments that Israel made. But even the more serious arguments, the human shields, etc., they just didn't stand up to the evidence that South Africa put forward showing, these indiscriminate, disproportionate forms of warfare. So I think that this was a real repudiation of Israel, even though, it's not a finding of definitive genocide, it's a finding of plausible genocide. That's a pretty low standard. But it's a low standard deliberately because the stakes are high. You don't want to wait until you're completely sure that genocide is happening because a lot of people get killed. So if there's a plausible case, there's reason for the court to step in. Now, in terms of your argument about a rules-based order, which is, a mantra you hear from many Western capitals these days, Western governments have a problem because you can't have a rules-based order when there's an Israel exception. And it's not clear that Western governments are really willing to apply the rule of law to Israel. There was very little support for the International Court of Justice decision. They kind of treated it as, an affront and how dare they. And it's not as if this is, a crazy group of judges. I mean, this was a 15-2 ruling, and in a couple of respects, even the Israeli judge joined the majority, so it was 16-1. It was only the Ugandan judge that voted against. So this is a pretty overwhelming ruling. And for governments like Britain or the United States to say, well, we think they made a mistake, we don't really buy it. It's just, that's not how it works. And it wouldn't have been so difficult to say, this is a serious court, it's the world's highest court, we respect the judgment, and we urge Israel to comply. That would have been very simple. But they never said that.
So as you were saying, Hamas is a non-state actor, and usually Human Rights Watch deals with reports on states. And so you said that there's less attention on Hamas for this reason. How does this influence Human Rights Watch's capacity to hold Hamas to account? And how would you approach it differently?
Well, what's interesting is that even though international human rights law applies only to governments, international humanitarian law, the laws of war, applies to both sides. Common Article 3 of the 1949 Geneva Conventions explicitly applies to both sides, as do the protocols. And indeed, Human Rights Watch within the human rights community was basically the first international group that started using humanitarian law for precisely this reason. This is back in the 1980s during the conflicts in Central America with El Salvador and Nicaragua, where you just couldn't credibly look at only government abuses. You needed to look at rebel abuses. And the only way you could do that was not with human rights law, but with humanitarian law. And so that conceptually is how we did it. And then in terms of basically as operating principles, whenever there's a war, we as a matter of principle look at the conduct of both sides. And it doesn't mean we equate both sides. You often have one side that's much worse perpetrator than the other, but we will always look at both sides. So in the Israel-Palestine context, in addition to looking at the Israeli government, we look at Hamas, at Islamic Jihad, at the Palestinian Authority, and Hezbollah. And our reporting, depending when, includes all of it. So the 2006 war between Israel and Hezbollah, we looked at Hezbollah's conduct. We've done many reports on Hamas. We've done reports on, kind of suicide bombing, looking at the Palestinian Authority as a whole. And so, I don't pretend that we do the same number of reports on them as on Israel because the ability to do exact harm is very, very different. But we do follow that principle. So I have no qualms about calling Hamas what it is. What it did on October 7th was horrible. It was, clear war crimes, as I said. It is a military dictatorship. There's nothing terribly defensible about Hamas.
And just finally, before we turn over to the audience, there's this idea that some people propagate, which is that Israel, for all of its war crimes, is a society with a civil society. And so there are groups like B'Tselem within Israel who do this kind of investigative work, and therefore groups like Human Rights Watch shouldn't pay as much attention because, unlike a society like Egypt, for example, where we read a really interesting report on a massacre in Egypt that we'll talk about later, where if you do that work, you can be imprisoned or killed. In Israel, at least if you're Jewish or if you're a citizen of the state of Israel and not a Palestinian, you can. What is your response to that?
Well, let me answer it in two respects. First of all, most of what we're talking about here are not abuses within Israel. They're abuses in the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem, where it's not a democracy. It's an occupation. And the B'Tselem, which is the leading Israeli human rights group, which is an excellent group, its equivalent in the West Bank is Al-Haq. Israel has said Al-Haq is a terrorist group, which is wacko. It's an incredibly effective, respected organization. But it has tarred Al-Haq and several of its colleagues as terrorist organizations just to try to silence them. So the idea that there's others who can do this work is just not true. The other thing, though, is that it is really, as a matter of principle, Human Rights Watch has to address democracies. And I remember when the argument that you're making was made most prominently to try to get us not to work on Israel, I said, I can answer this view that we should ignore democracies with two words: George Bush. Because this argument was made at the height of Bush's so-called war on terrorism, height of the torture of the Guantanamo. And did anybody really think that Human Rights Watch should ignore all of that because the United States is a democracy? And it was not even plausible. And so we obviously do pay attention. We don't just replicate the work of local groups, but there is often significant work to be done even within democracies, and even democracies can commit serious abuses.
We have a ton of questions, but maybe we can turn it over to the audience now. Yeah, you're back there.
Hi, so just to slightly contextualize my question, I've sort of been a grassroots human rights worker for the Ahmadi community in Pakistan, and I'm sure you're sort of aware of the situation faced by sort of the Ahmadis in the country. The reason I add that context is this sort of current crisis, right? Or however you want to frame a genocide, war, conflict. It's put a lot, I think people sort of haven't quite recognized the spillover effect it's had on other marginalized and persecuted and sort of oppressed communities across the globe, right? Because a lot of these communities, like Ahmadis, they're so restricted in their own countries in terms of their space and their advocacy work that they sort of rely on a lot of their advocacy and lobbying on sort of Western countries. And so a lot of these communities are now thinking, seeing the sort of kind of hypocrisy of the West in the way they dealt with this and the way they dealt with Russia and kind of everything, like, do we really want to be aligning ourselves with sort of countries that obviously maybe don't uphold human rights to the extent that they claim to? And the other sort of damaging effect is, like, say, for example, UK or America, when these countries advocate on behalf of these communities. For example, in Pakistan, right, we had a human rights minister, Iran-Contra, and she kind of became a bit of a parody because every time on Twitter something horrific would happen to a religious minority community, she'd be like, well, what about Islamophobia in the West? Like, that was her pet response to literally sort of everything. But now, sort of, it's become less of a parody, and now people, sort of stakeholders who, within, like, if I use Pakistan's example, who uphold the oppression of religious minority communities, they now actually can go back to the sort of general public and be like, do we really need to take lectures from, you know, these countries? So in terms of the future paradigm of human rights work and human rights lobbying and advocacy, I think the current crisis, let's say, has had a deeply damaging effect, not just on Palestinians, but communities across the world. And I sort of just wanted your thoughts on how you see the future of advocacy within this field in the years ahead.
Okay, now that's a good question. I mean, let me begin by noting that the power of human rights advocacy, you know, does, as you suggest, in part involve invoking influential Western governments to put pressure on a target government to better respect human rights. But the core of our work is really aimed at the population of a country in question. Because, you know, human rights are not Western impositions. I mean, everybody wants human rights. You know, nobody wants to be, you know, persecuted because of their religion, for example. And so by documenting and exposing what governments are doing to its citizens, the first audience are the people of that country. Because every government has to pretend to respect human rights. And when we show that they don't, you know, that can be delegitimate. So the fact that, you know, you're absolutely right that Western governments right now have a credibility problem. Part of that credibility problem is their unwillingness to hold Israel to the same standards as anybody else. But even before that, you know, there has been a real, I think, movement away from the principled support of human rights because of the prioritization of building coalitions against Russia with respect to Ukraine and against China. And this effort to sort of prioritize geopolitical alliances has led, you know, various governments to say, well, we're not going to look too closely at the Saudi crown prince's abuses, or, you know, we're not going to look too closely at what Modi's doing to Muslims in India, because these are kind of useful allies with respect to China or Russia. And that, you know, that was a problem even before October 7th. I'll tell you just one story involving Pakistan. A few years ago, when Imran Khan was still prime minister, he came to New York during the General Assembly to try to push for greater attention to Kashmir, you know, the one Muslim-majority part of India. And so, I sat down with him, and we had a talk about, you know, the importance of trying to get more attention to Kashmir. But I said, you know, it's great that you're pushing Kashmir, but what about Xinjiang? You know, because here, you know, Kashmir, these are Muslims in India, but Xinjiang, you've got the Uyghurs, who are the large Muslim population in China, who are facing incredibly severe persecution. You know, mass detention, mass consignment to forced labor. Why don't you bring them up? And he basically said, I can't. You know, China owns us economically. You know, so this sort of double standard exists across the board, and you know, the most we can do is to try to fight against it and push for more principled perspective of human rights.
Yes, sorry, yes.
Me?
Yep.
My question is, what could the US administration realistically do at this stage? You know, apply the sort of personal preferences notwithstanding. I mean, of course, you know, they could use that leverage regarding weapons sales. But one idea that's been sort of floating around is, so to speak, of the US government could have preemptively and essentially unilaterally recognize a future Palestinian state in the 1960 whatever borders, subject to the condition that a sort of civilian administration emerges in the future. Could you comment on that?
No, I mean, I know that that idea is kicking around. I'm not sure how efficacious that would be. I mean, I can think of, I already mentioned conditioning or cutting off the aid or the arms sales, but other things that could be done. The U.S. could not veto a strong UN Security Council resolution. That would be very powerful. The U.S. could openly accept that the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction in Palestine, something it has never said so far. That would be significant. The U.S. could announce that it accepts that Israel is committing apartheid in the occupied territory. You could even say, we think that what Israel is doing in Gaza, that these are war crimes, rather than just say, don't do it. They could say these are war crimes. All of those things would be quite significant. They would really move the needle in a way that I think mere, rhetorical recognition of a Palestinian state that doesn't have any meaning on the ground wouldn't get out.
Yeah.
So my question is that, in my understanding, the war is between a state versus another state, or a state versus a militant group, as you just rightly described what was happening in Israel and Gaza. And during this, we always lose innocent lives, and we dehumanize them as well. Who's accountable for these lives, first of all? And when this happens next time, I hope not, but it happens somewhere else, how do we actually save these lives? Because during every war, even 2 years ago we were talking about Russia and Ukraine, we lost so many lives then. 2 years later we were again talking about that. How do we, yes, Israel is giving these warnings that we're going to bombard this building, etc. But how do we not lose any innocent lives?
That's a good question. Yes, civilians die in war, but whether that's an unfortunate tragedy or whether it's a war crime depends on compliance with international humanitarian law. That's what that law is there for. That sets forth the rules that are aimed to minimize civilian harm, and that, if flouted, are war crimes. So, enforcing that law, meaning charging and prosecuting people for violating it, the most senior officials responsible, that's one way to try to curtail these kind of atrocities in the next war. And if taking the Ukraine example, what Putin has done in Ukraine, indiscriminately bombing cities, deliberately bombing civilian institutions, is exactly what he did in Syria. It's exactly what he did in Chechnya. And he was never prosecuted for those. So there's no real surprise that he just did it again in Ukraine. Now, finally, in Ukraine, there's international criminal court jurisdiction. I wish Karim Khan would, get off his derriere and start acting. He's charged Putin with the modest sort of sideshow issue of abducting Ukrainian children, which is important, but it's not, killing people. Nothing else. And that would be useful. And it would be useful similarly if he were to charge sooner rather than later for what's going on in Gaza.
Okay. Yes. Anything else? Yeah, go for it. Yeah, go for it.
So, if you could rewrite international humanitarian law, the Geneva Convention, and basically create a whole new framework, what would you change about the system that we can get rid of this sort of whole issue of accountability and making sure that there's no double standards anymore?
Well, I wouldn't rewrite the law. I think the law is fine. I think the issue is enforcement. And if you look at how do you enforce the Geneva Conventions, there are either the International Criminal Court or there are national efforts. The International Criminal Court, which was negotiated a little over 2 decades ago, at that time we tried to give it universal jurisdiction. We tried the argument that there's this concept of universal jurisdiction, which basically came out of piracy days. That the pirate is an enemy of everybody, and wherever the pirate can be found, they can be prosecuted. And now that same principle applies to genocide, crimes against humanity, to war crimes, to torture, to aggression. And we argued, since any national court could prosecute these crimes, national governments should be able to delegate this power to the International Criminal Court. The US went crazy. A few other governments were crazy too. That didn't happen. And so what we got instead was a compromise. The court has jurisdiction over nationals whose government has joined the court. That's straightforward. Nobody cared about that. It also has jurisdiction over crimes committed on the territory of a government that's joined the court, regardless of who does it. So that's how Putin was charged with Ukraine. Ukraine is given jurisdiction of the court. Russia never joined the court. The court has territorial jurisdiction. They could charge Putin. That's the same principle that's being used in Gaza now. Israel never joined the court, but Palestine, recognized as an observer state by the UN General Assembly, did join the court, did give the court jurisdiction, therefore it can prosecute them. But that, use of territorial jurisdiction doesn't work for Syria. It doesn't work for China. There are a lot of parts of the world it doesn't work at all. So I would love to see an international court that did really have universal jurisdiction. Barring that, we're seeing more and more national governments exercise universal jurisdiction, principally over Syria. Germany's been at the forefront of this, but you're seeing efforts in France and in Switzerland. And there is a limit there. They're not allowed to go after the head of state, but they can go after generals right up to the top. And I would like to see more of that. It requires governments really investing in war crimes units because your local prosecutor has no idea. You need to really have somebody who is trained to prosecute international crimes, that has the expertise to know what's going on in Gaza or Syria or whatever. So I would like to see much more investment in that. And if you had those two pillars of international law operating, that would make a big difference in terms of undercutting the impunity that lies behind many of these crimes.
Yes, can I proceed? Yeah.
I would be interested in your views on the potential of the human rights framework for regulating risks from future technologies. So on a certain level, we could understand human rights as an operationalization of the fact that there are certain harms that should be done to no human being. Maybe there are technologies that could enable some unforeseen harms. Could human rights be used for that purpose?
I mean, to put this in perspective, international human rights law is pretty vague. So, does international human rights law say anything about artificial intelligence? No, they didn't even know about artificial intelligence. So we shouldn't, put too much faith in the letter of the law. But the human rights methodology, which is really about, developing facts, carefully investigating a situation, and then bouncing those facts off of public morality, off a public sense of what's right and wrong, and actually helping to develop that sense of right and wrong, and using that to then generate moral pressure on governments to do the right thing. That is something that clearly can operate. To give you an example, Human Rights Watch has been very involved in this effort to stop what we call killer robots, which is sort of the colloquial term used for fully autonomous lethal weapons. So not a rifle that I aim at somebody, but rather, something that I kind of program a computer, say, go look for this guy with a beard, and kill him, and set him off. And the computer then decides whether to kill you or not. And that is wrong. We're trying to keep a human in the loop and force a human to make that ultimate decision. We're pushing to get a treaty on this, and many governments are pushing back. We don't have the treaty right now. So that's an example of, of AI that is streaming out for regulation, but we don't have it yet. And then obviously there are other, illustrations of, misuses of algorithms, misuses of AI, which are easy to envision. But to use the human rights methodology, you've really got to do the careful factual investigation and help to develop a sense of right and wrong that is clear enough that you, in a sense, compel governments to abide by that public sense of morality.
Thank you.
the end, but I do want to come to you right there.
And you mentioned earlier the enforcement mechanism of the Security Councils, where the US has a veto vote. And considering that has been the case, I guess, for implementation of human rights, not just now, but prior, and also the fact that so much of what Israel does and how much it respects human rights depends on the US, and as you mentioned, actually one person in particular, more than anyone, Joe Biden. It shows to me that the human rights framework and its implementation seems just so fragile, or at least skewed, and up to the interpretation of the US. Has it done anything to reduce harm in the Israel-Gaza war? Has it been completely performative?
No, I think Biden and Blinken and others have genuinely been pushing Israel to take greater care to spare civilians and to open up the border to humanitarian aid. I think they've been 100% genuine in that. I think they've spoken forcefully, both privately and publicly. That's not just demonstrative. I think that's real. What they haven't yet done, as I mentioned, is characterize what Israel's doing or impose the sanction of conditioning or stopping the aid in the arms sales. So there's more that they could do. But I don't want to pretend they've done nothing, because they are trying. But they, whether for personal or political reasons, are not going as far as I want them to go.
Okay, there's one person right in the back, and then we're gonna I think call it a day. Yeah, you in the back there. I think you're wearing green.
Hi, thank you for coming today. I appreciated you mentioning Modi's Islamophobic policies with Kashmiri Muslims, because I think there's this obvious stronghold that the Israel lobby has both on the Hill in DC and internationally. But I was wondering, there's probably a better way to put this, but you were and are at the top of the humanitarian food chain, and considering what's going on with UNRWA and whatnot, what were your experiences with the Israel lobby, especially in terms of talking about what's going on in Palestine, and how do you see that playing out in the future as we try and open up humanitarian aid to Gaza?
Look, I'm always reluctant to talk about the Israel lobby, because I just don't think it's, I think it's a kind of oversimplification, in the sense that, if you take the United States, there is this group AIPAC, which is a powerful lobbying group made up of, pretty to the right Jews, that does not represent the American Jewish population at all. In fact, the American Jews, for the most part, are liberal and are pretty unhappy with what Netanyahu is doing. And indeed, Netanyahu has largely given up on American Jews, other than that, and sees his base of support as being Christian evangelicals, who, for completely separate religious reasons, are supporters of Israel. So Netanyahu's kind of given up on the Democratic Party, where most Jews reside, and has gone with Trump and the Republicans. So that's that's why it's kind of much more complicated than just to say the Israeli Jewish lobby. At Human Rights Watch, look, I'm regularly lambasted for my criticism of Israel, and it's just kind of par for the course. When I was running Human Rights Watch, I certainly wanted to make sure that our reporting on Israel was accurate, that it was principled, that we were looking at both sides. But if we were going to then get attacked for doing that, I'm happy to be attacked, And it, financially, it didn't matter. Because if your top priority is defending Israel, you're not going to contribute to Human Rights Watch. We're not the organization for you. But if you want, fair application of human rights norms around the world, we'll do that. And so the people who supported us wanted that, and tended to go with us, even if they were not thrilled about our criticism of Israel. They just knew you had to do that. So it was never a big problem. And I'm just, I was never that worried about it. You bring up UNRWA, and maybe we should say a word about UNRWA, because we haven't really discussed that. What Israel's doing with UNRWA right now is really kind of a dirty trick. Because, let's take at face value their claim that a dozen UNRWA employees were participants in October 7th. The people who've looked at that, including the Financial Times, which is hardly far left, have not found any evidence to support that, but let's just sort of take it at face value, that there were these dozen employees. UNRWA's response to that was exactly what they should have done. You know, in fact, in some ways you could argue they went too far, but they fired the people, they launched an investigation, they, you know, made clear that this is not what they stand for. But nonetheless, everybody is now suspending funds to UNRWA. And this, you know, not in an ordinary time, but at a moment when UNRWA is by far and away the primary and really the only vehicle to feed 2.3 million Palestinians who are largely starving. And to cut off funding when they have no reserves, because Trump had previously cut off funding, is really to kind of aggravate the starvation. And what this is really about, I just did this debate with sort of a former Israeli Knesset member who is, you know, I thought it did a good job of reflecting the Israeli government point of view, which is they like to blame UNRWA for the Palestinian refugee problem. You know, and they hate UNRWA because UNRWA, in their view, perpetuates this idea that if you're, you know, a Palestinian in Lebanon or Syria, or for that matter, Gaza, that, you know, rather than just accept that you are where you are, it allows them to continue to be refugees hoping to go back to Israel. And they have this naive view that, you know, if they got rid of UNRWA, Palestinian refugees would stop thinking of themselves as Palestinian refugees. And, you know, we wouldn't talk about the Nakba anymore, we wouldn't talk about 1948. This would all just be, you know, water under the bridge, bad things happen in life, move on, get on with it, you know. And I just think that that's, you know, it's naive, but, you know, governments are reluctant to contradict the Israeli government, so they're going along with this attack on UNRWA. When, you know, the motivation of the attack is this, you know, effort to sort of somehow forget 1948, but the humanitarian consequences are disastrous if this is proceeding in the current way.
It's on that poignant note that I think we'll end. But please join me in thanking Kenneth Roth for joining us today.